Good morning. Thank you. It is indeed an honor to be able to talk with you today. My disclosure is actually in my bio sketch. To give you a little background, my experience with dietary reference intakes was initially as a government project officer to write some of the task statements working with the F&B, and then to help find the money. And then later, it was to take what the committees had said in the 6 nutrient reports and 2 application reports and help put them into a single volume for dietitians, and also explain what was in the report. So my knowledge comes from watching the process, sitting in on some of the deliberations when I was at the Food and Nutrition Board, and then helping to explain. Today I'm going to talk about a little bit of context, upper level derivation, 2 examples, takeaway, and then some resources, since this will be available online so you can look at them. Context, what are DRIs? I think you all know, but I'm going to say it anyway. A family of reference values that are quantitative estimates to be used for planning and assessing diets for healthy populations. I think the purpose is important. They provide scientific underpinning for a range of uses listed on the slide, from population uses, planning and evaluating nutrition assistance programs like school lunch, dietary guidelines, food labeling, product formulation, and diet counseling. They are nutrient reference values for the US and Canada, and they are based on a framework that was developed by the Food and Nutrition Board that replaced and expanded the 1991 to 1989 approach for the US, which was recommended dietary allowances, and that's all laid out in the source cited, and it's available online. Now the framework, this new framework, going from 1 value, a recommended dietary allowance, to a multiple, was brought about because of concern that there are a lot of uses, and so one needs recommendations for a variety of uses, that would require multiple reference points based on a concept of the dual risk curve of too little and too much is bad and something in the middle is good, that there was a need to provide estimates of upper levels of intakes because of concerns about increasing supplement use in fortified foods, that the reduction of chronic disease risk needed to be even more explicitly included as data permitted. Other food components needed to be looked at, for example, carotenoids, and that there needed to be clear rationale given for the decisions made. There was a lot of concern at that time that the old recommended dietary allowances the committees had said, this is the data, this is the number, without enough explanation, and that led to a number of unpleasantness. The DRI undertaking, this is to show you that it was complex, that there were a number of expert committees. People in the room have served on those committees or chaired them. I put this slide up to show you that there was a separate subcommittee put together to develop an approach for upper reference levels. Those of you in nutrition know that historically the focus has always been on getting enough, and so the concern about too much is relatively new. Joe Rodricks was on that initial committee and chaired it as it continued along. So the DRI family, these are the values. Estimated average requirement, recommended dietary allowance. Estimated average requirement was just a median of a distribution. Recommended dietary allowance was 2 standard deviations above the mean or the median, and was said to protect from whatever the endpoint chosen, 97.5% of the population. Adequate intake was a number either experimentally chosen or chosen as a sort of mean of what a healthy intake would be. It was developed by the first committee that looked at DRIs, and it was on calcium and a number of other nutrients. When they didn't feel like they had enough data to set an average requirement, and they didn't want to wave their hands and say, this is smoke and mirrors. They said, okay, there's another number we're going to give you, but it's a second best number. But this is to help you realize that. And then the tolerable upper intake, which is what I'm talking about today. And as you all know, another addition later on in the process was something called the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, which was a percent of intake from energy and was a way to pull together the energy-producing nutrients. This is the model, the dual risk model that you'll see in every DRI book and a lot of publications, showing the risk of inadequacy and the risk of adverse effects. Interestingly, and I'll show you the definition, interestingly, adverse effects was really only used in this model to connote upper levels, although one would say that a deficiency of some enzyme that leads to further problems could say it's an adverse effect. This is the distributional model of the estimated average requirement and the RDA. And from what I've been able to understand in some of the reading I've done, especially the directions pointed to by Johanna Dwyer, you know, the committee probably wanted, or initially the Food and Nutrition Board probably wanted to do an upper distribution that was like this, and they didn't have the data. So that would have been nice symmetry. So tolerable upper intake levels. Highest level of daily nutrient intake likely to pose no risks of adverse health effects to almost all individuals in the general population. The book that Chris put on the slide that held up the model, that talked about the model, and made the point that it was to be tolerable, that is something that's tolerated biologically, that's where the tolerable comes from. It was a tolerable intake, not implying any benefit. It's not a recommended intake. And it's an upper level, not an upper limit. As any of you know, if you've ever said upper limit in front of Allison Yates, who was the director involved in all of these discussions. It uses a risk assessment approach. They apparently considered a mathematical, more of an algorithmic approach, and realized they didn't have the data, so discarded that. So it uses a risk assessment approach, assumes a threshold effect, uses total intake if adverse effects were associated with total intake, and if the adverse effects were associated with supplements or fortificants only, it was based on intake from those sources. The derivation, I'll talk about this with a couple of examples. First of all, the adverse effect identification, and then a dose response assessment, which included identifying the NOAEL or LOAEL and an uncertainty assessment. The definition that was used and was reported in the book that Chris showed, and that chapter, updated a little bit, is in every single dietary reference intake nutrient volume, including the newer vitamin D and calcium, although, Chris, it's much more eloquently stated in there. Any significant alteration in the structure or function of the human organism, or any impairment of a physiologically important function, which parallels what Joe said. Adverse effect identification. The idea was to look at evidence of adverse effects in humans, causality, relevance of experimental data, pharmacokinetic and metabolic data. This was actually added. I think they did it all along, but this was added specifically in some of the later accounts of the UL process. Mechanism of action, quality and completeness of the database, and identification of distinct and highly sensitive populations. Okay, so how did it go? We're going to talk about vitamin A, in particular women of reproductive age. These are the tolerable upper intake levels. To find those, they looked at 4 potential adverse effects: bone mineral density, liver abnormalities, teratogenicity, and bulging fontanelle, and chose liver abnormalities for most adults, but teratogenicity in women of reproductive age and a bulging fontanelle in infants as indicators, endpoints of adverse effects. These were the adverse effects. So let's go a little bit deeper. Women of reproductive age, what data? They had epidemiological studies which evaluated the teratogenicity of vitamin intake shortly before or during pregnancy. They felt that since they had some human data, they would not use animal data. They had 5 case control studies, 2 cohort studies, and a letter. You can see that one of the themes will be insufficient data. They were able to choose a NOAEL of 45,000 micrograms per day of preformed vitamin A from food and supplements. So this was looking at above any intake from food. They felt that there was limited epi data to clearly define dose response in the range of 3,000 to 7,800 micrograms per day. They chose what they believed was a conservative value given that there were no adverse effects below that level. So basically what they did is take a number for which they saw no adverse effects below that level. That was the dose response assessment. Now, how did they decide the uncertainty factor? They needed to consider variation between individuals, animal to human extrapolations, short-term versus chronic exposures, whether they used a LOAEL or a NOAEL, small numbers, and severity. For women of reproductive age, they chose an uncertainty factor of 1.5. And I'm guessing that was a lot of discussion between the nutritionists and the toxicologists on that committee. That's a pretty low number. They chose it based on inter-individual variability in susceptibility. They stated that they didn't think a higher UF was justified because there were no adverse effects in doses up to 3,000. So that's how they came up with 3,000 micrograms per day. Other adults, based on case reports, used liver toxicity as a measure, following much the same process. So why was the uncertainty factor so low? Well, within a certain range, nutrients are essential. So there is years of sort of trial at certain levels where there apparently have been no adverse effects, and I think they built that in. That was the second bullet. And they believed that if the data were from humans, there would be less uncertainty than with animals, so that the normal factor for animal to human wouldn't need to be put in there. So that was one snapshot of vitamin A. Here's a snapshot from folate. This focused on supplementary folate, and this was done in the late 90s when it was early days. It was early days. Animal studies, in vitro tissue and cell culture studies were looked at. There were potential Adverse effects, a whole range were looked at: neurological, general toxicity, reproductive and developmental, carcinogenicity, hypersensitivity, and intestinal zinc absorption. So focus on animal studies, and they believed that there was limited but suggestive evidence from case reports, studies in monkeys, metabolic interaction, that excessive folate may precipitate or exacerbate neuropathy in vitamin B12 deficient individuals. And so that is what they used as the critical endpoint for development of an upper level. For their dose response assessment, they used case reports of oral administration in B12 deficiency. They found no data for a NOAEL. A LOAEL they set at 5 milligrams, and you can see the reasons on the slide. An uncertainty factor of 5 because of the severity and the fact that they had used a LOAEL. And this shows you their calculation. So how did it work? How did the whole UL process work? Well, they were able to establish, out of around 40-some nutrients and food substances, ULs for 8 vitamins and 15 minerals. They did not establish for 7 vitamins and 6 minerals. And they made the point that even though they didn't set a UL, one still needed to be cautious. For 3 of those, vitamin E, niacin, and folate, the UL was set based on synthetic nutrients, not the amount in food. So what did we learn, or what did the committees learn? What have we all learned? Insufficient chronic exposure and dose response data, not always threshold effects. The uncertainty factor is challenging because of the dual risk curve. Adult recommendations sometimes were greater than the child upper level. This was the case certainly for zinc and vitamin A. The going back and forth between animal and human data was challenging because of different metabolic requirements in animals. And there was a general sense that one needed to explore newer technologies, better animal data, and so forth, echoing what I believe Joe had said. 5 takeaways that I have from looking at all of this and watching the process. DRI upper level was a major step forward, and it was intended to meet a recognized concern, so it's a major step forward. Judgment was a critically important part of the process. Challenges obviously remain in obtaining data and in their application. There are many opportunities for creativity, and we need to do a better job of understanding our differing histories and perspectives and technical languages, certainly amongst nutrition, but probably even subsets within nutrition and toxicology. So, thank you very much. These are some resources that I used in the talk and some others that you may find of use if you want to explore the process further. Thank you.